Thank you, everybody, for turning out tonight. I just wanted to sort of connect the dots a little bit. We are delighted to have Stephen here this evening to talk, and I'll say a couple remarks in just a second about his background. But of course, we're doing this all in celebration of the Asian Treasures exhibition that's on the second floor. The gallery is open tonight, so if you haven't seen the show, well, even if you have seen the show, it's your chance to go visit your favorite things for a few minutes afterward. David, I know all of it is your favorite things, so pick one afterwards and we'll go see it. But this is our major show, major exhibition for this year with artifacts graciously lent by David Billings and Beverly Hall, and we're delighted to be showcasing all of that. And so this program and some others that we've done are sort of expanding on some of the themes and some of the ideas in that show around Asian art, art of China over time, and trying to sort of expand our horizons, looking at and understanding some of these materials better. And I can think of nobody better than Stephen Chait to be here to help explain some of the context around the material that David and Beverly collect, some of the material that they collect. Stephen is president of the Ralph M. Chait Galleries in New York City, which were founded in 1910 by his grandfather. And it's the oldest specialist dealing in fine Chinese porcelains and works of art in the United States. The gallery today works with early ceramics and headstone carvings, scholars' rocks, and China trade objects, and maintains a special focus on Ming and Qing porcelains, both in Chinese taste and in the Western taste, which I'm hoping we'll hear more about tonight. The Chait Gallery is a longtime exhibitor at many major antique fairs, including, of course, the Nantucket Summer Antiques Show, which we've just heard about, and we're delighted to be on the coattails of that ourselves tonight, as well as the Philadelphia Show, the Winter Show, and the Delaware Antiques Show. So without any further ado, please let me invite Stephen to come forward, and if we could all say hello.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for that really kind introduction, and Jocelyn, it's been a pleasure to meet you, and I thank you for your kind words and enthusiasm through all this. And I thank everybody tonight for coming to join us in this interesting, I hope interesting discussion. Before I get started, though, I have to just acknowledge the obvious. Never in my life have I shared a speaking quarters with a skeleton of a sperm whale, and it brings back memories from grade school doing theater productions where I was always told you never share a stage with children or animals because they're much more interesting distractions. So hopefully this is a more familiar animal to you all, and it won't be too distracting, or I won't be too distracted, but it's wonderful. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Nantucket, and particularly tonight speaking at the NHA in connection to this wonderful exhibition of Asian treasures from David and Beverly Billings' fantastic collection. So I happen to see these two individuals sitting right over in front of me, so please allow me to just take a second to thank you for sharing your enthusiasm for Asian art and, in my niche, Chinese art and its culture, and sharing so many wonderful pieces from your collection with everyone. It's really a joy to see this exhibition come to fruition. I've heard about it for years. I've seen the collection grow for years, and it's really fantastic, so thank you very much. So my discussion, my modest discussion tonight, is just one niche that's covered in the Billings collection, and that is going to be the history of Chinese porcelain in the West for a short period of about 500 years. So this topic is, of course, extraordinarily large. It's filled with all sorts of rabbit holes and interesting diversions that you can go in any direction, but I will do my best to keep us focused and moving so we can cover a lot of territory in this relatively short amount of time. So I think before embarking on any discussion of this, I will bore you to just say we should get our bearings a little bit, and let's just define a few terms. So let's start with the obvious. What exactly is Chinese porcelain? And we'll refer to it after this introduction just as porcelain. But what is Chinese porcelain? And how did it come about to be a part of Chinese cultural history? So at its basic, porcelain is a very high-fired ceramic. I just realized I have to turn this on, so one moment. Okay. It's a very high-fired ceramic. It fires at about 1,350 degrees Celsius, which translates to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. It is made from two major components. One is called kaolin, which is also known as China clay, and that is a stone that is rich in silicate, so it has a lot of quartz in it. The second component is patunce. I call it patunce. It's really a Chinese term, and I will butcher the proper pronunciation. I think it's close to patunce, and that is also known as China stone. And China stone was a different type of aggregate that has a lot of feldspar in it. So grinding, purifying, filtering, and continually doing this process over and over again ultimately resulted, whoops, did I lose? There. Okay. Ultimately resulted in making porcelain clay, and from that clay we get what is known as porcelain. So the visual characteristics of porcelain are the following. It's very white in color. It is sonorous. If we give it a gentle tap, it should have a bit of a bell-like sound to it. It is translucent, sometimes remarkably so. Light can shine through it quite effectively. It's able to be very thinly potted. It's impervious to liquids, and it's able to take a glaze quite readily, which is why we know it and love it as sort of a wonderful decorative art. Kaolin has been referred to as the bones of porcelain, and patunce has been referred to as its flesh. It's a nice combination of terms because porcelain, though we think of it as very fragile, is actually quite a strong material. If you think about fixtures in your home or a lot of tiles that today are made from porcelain, it's not quite as fragile as we think. But it's also able to be thinly potted and made into a variety of different shapes and types that we know and love in the decorative arts. So China has a remarkable multi-thousand-year continuous history, and it also at the same time has a multi-thousand-year-old material cultural history that includes ceramics. But it might surprise you to know that porcelain actually only came into the picture rather late in the game, relatively. And it was first invented, as best we know, sometime in the middle of the 13th century, so about 700 years ago. So porcelain is something we automatically associate with China. Silk, of course, comes from China, and their tea, can come from China. Other things come from China, but it seems to be the only substance that is readily connected to China. When you think of, like, somebody has a fine dinner service, it's their fine china. So somehow there's this wonderful connection between this unique type of ceramic and China as a geographical place and as a cultural place. So again, it began in the 13th century, and let me just go to our first slide and show you. I'm not supposed to turn my back to the camera too much, but I'll do it just for a second. Porcelain in China has been made traditionally in two particular regions. One is Kangxi province, which is here in the southeast, and in the north of that region is an area called Zhengdezhen. Zhengdezhen was the porcelain capital of China from the very beginning, and it was famous for most of all the porcelain production from that period on. The location of Zhengdezhen and porcelain was quite natural because it was in that area that the primary ingredients for porcelain, the kaolin and the patunce, were found in sufficient quantities in the surrounding mountains. It was also a very wooded area, and it was wood that supplied the kilns that fired everything, the ovens that made porcelain. Now, in addition to being a good location for the source of the raw materials, it was really well located next to rivers and waterways, which would connect it to a province down here called Guangdong. And in Guangdong was the famous city Canton, or Guangzhou. And Guangzhou, Canton, was the city where all foreigners were restricted in their trade from China in antiquity. So it was a natural fit. The materials were there, the transportation was there, so no shock. It became the major source of porcelain. Going to our next slide, having just said that Zhengdezhen was the center of porcelain production, there is a neighboring province called Fujian, just to the east. And in the north, there's an area called Dehua. Dehua was where another type of porcelain was made that's also very well known in the West, not in the same quantity, but in all truth, yes, it was a very big area of porcelain production, and it's where the famous Blanc de Chine, the white glazed porcelains, were produced. We'll talk about that more a bit later, but we'll keep it in mind. So between these two provinces, that pretty much had the monopoly on porcelain production in China from antiquity and even today. And Zhengdezhen was the one that had the highest I think, industry going on, and it continues today, as we said. Now, I'm illustrating here, if you look at the slide, these are 4 watercolors that show porcelain production in Jingdezhen. The dates of these watercolors date to about the 1820s, and they were originally part of a larger set that could be 18 or even 24, depending how complex the artist wanted to get. Each watercolor illustrated a different aspect of porcelain production. So these were made for the West. They often got divided for decorative purposes. It's rare outside of certain museums to have an entire group. The ones that you see up here in particular relate to porcelain production, the shaping of porcelain, and some early decorations in its process. The earlier watercolors from this would have shown the actual mining of the kaolin and patunce and the sort of pounding it and purifying it and such and bringing it as clay bricks to Jingdezhen. And then the equally interesting ones after this section, which I find interesting because this shows you how it was actually being fashioned and parts of porcelain decoration, how it was dried just before it went into the kiln. The future drawings after this would have been the kiln work and then taking it to Canton for sale to Europe. So as I mentioned, porcelain was created in the 13th century, and from that time, it immediately entered the Chinese market. It had an immediate following, and at the same time, it actually entered the export market quite immediately as well. China's direct trade partners at that time in the 1200s were pretty much the local or neighboring Asian countries. And somewhat interestingly, or quite interestingly, they had direct trade with the Middle East. Direct trade with the West, which is going to finally be the focus of our discussion, actually did not begin until about 300 years later, until the mid-1500s. And that was during Western Europe's age of exploration, when the Portuguese, and then soon followed by the Spanish, first established solid direct trading routes with China and got entree to their markets. Original European exploration of China, or to China, was certainly not about obtaining porcelain and necessarily decorative arts. It was about finding good trade routes to circumnavigate the globe. It was looking for more commodities, the famous silk and spices. But what's interesting is that porcelain and decorative arts, and we'll focus on the porcelain, entered into the equation from the very beginning. So it may seem odd that porcelain would become such an interesting fascination at that time, but I think it was for a number of reasons. And that is that it filled a niche of being exotic, unusual, and beautiful. And then number 4, it was hard to obtain. So being exotic and unusual, what do I mean? At that time, there was no porcelain production in Europe. That would not come, we'll discuss it later, until the very early 1700s. So there are people who collect everything, there's beauty in everything, but contemporary European ceramics were very different from Chinese porcelain. They were probably coarser, maybe not as finely designed. You didn't have sort of the thinness that you could get with porcelain, and with some bias, you probably couldn't get quite the colors and the preciseness of the painting. So that caused some immediate interest. In particular, that's the exotic and unusual. Beautiful, it met a ready market. People loved it from the start, so it struck a chord. And then that it was hard to obtain, I think, is kind of the cherry on top, in a sense, because the travel to China there and back could easily take 2 years. And as we know, a lot of travel to China ended in shipwrecks. So it was a very dangerous kind of proposal to go on voyages to China. The merchants who engaged in it were looking to make money. Quite honestly, it was a trade route. But all this together, the exoticness, foreign cultures, the subjects on the Chinese porcelain, I think added a lot of romance and interest to a European market that had never seen or could conceive of this type of grand culture that existed so far away. So it was a very, very good match. So what was the first type of porcelain that basically came to Europe? What we have up here, I'm going to face the camera, is what's known as a Kraak-ware dish. Kraak, not crack, like a crack in the porcelain, is Kraak, K-R-A-A-K. I will discuss the origin of that term shortly. It's quite interesting. Kraak-ware is the quintessential classic type of first porcelain that came to Europe, the first type of export porcelain. Most of it had a practical use. It was meant to be, or conceived and used, quite realistically, as eating vessels. They were plates, they were bowls, they were cups, there were sometimes serving pieces or pouring vessels on occasion. Most of it looked like this plate here. There's a center decoration. This one's quite finely painted with bird decoration, but you can find all sorts of plants, potted plants, figures, mythical animals. It's a whole interesting repertoire of designs. The center reserve is surrounded by these smaller reserves with complementary flowers and other animals and such. And it's really quite elegant. It could vary in quality. Some was better than others. Some had great deep blue, some didn't. Some was precisely painted, maybe some wasn't. Some kept its shape better than others. But it was wonderful and it was well received and exciting. So as beautiful as these pieces are in the front, you might be surprised to know that the reverse side is actually a bit cruder. Crackware definitively has a lot of sandy adhesions and what's called chatter marks, which were these little pattern sort of, it's not a flaw, but it's like a design thing. You have to see it in the porcelain. If I had one here, I'd show you. It's like little linear patterns that came when it was turned on a wheel. And they're a little rough to the finish. And while in the scheme of things, most crackware was artistically modest in comparison to later decorative porcelains that we'll soon discuss, it was in fact the first exposure in Europe to Chinese porcelain. And modest or not, it became a luxury item. Now the term crackware is actually a Dutch word that was a corruption of a Portuguese word. And the Portuguese word was Kraak. Kraak was a cargo ship. And in 1603, there happened to be a Portuguese cargo ship called the Catarina, which was commandeered by Dutch privateers in the Straits of Malacca. So they took it over, and they brought it back to Amsterdam. And with great fanfare, because the Dutch were the upcoming power of the sea and the European world at that time, they basically were allowed by those rules to take the cargo. They brought it back to Amsterdam. They had a very prominent sale, and it did extremely well. And in that sale were silks, porcelain, and lacquerware, but porcelain was definitely a big part of what was on that cargo, and it caused a sensation. And so the interest in Chinese porcelain then was beginning to expand outside of Portugal and Spain and beginning to spread throughout Europe. In the exhibition upstairs, I was happy to see, there's an old master painting from, I guess, Holland, or I didn't read the label, but somewhere like that. But basically, you will see in old master paintings from Belgium and that whole region of Europe, crackware, blue and white porcelain included in the paintings. So it's very interesting to see. They were used as functional pieces, but they were luxury items. In addition, you can sometimes find crackware in the early days, and such a rare, refined, unusual item coming to Europe. You'll find some pieces were given these beautiful silver mounts. You can find this in European silver and occasionally English as well. So as the dominance and command of the sea changed from Portugal to Spain, it soon then, of course, spread throughout to other European powers, and the market for Chinese porcelain expanded throughout Western Europe considerably. Now, while crackware was the primary type of porcelain that came from the mid-1500s to pretty much the mid-1600s, you would occasionally get other objects, such as this ewer that's in the form of a leaping carp. Crackware, as I mentioned, had a practical use. It had to do with dining and food. This, in China, would have been a wine pot, or sometimes called a teapot, but realistically probably a wine pot. To the European audience, I don't think they had any clue what it was whatsoever. It was a sort of strange animal. Today we know more about it than they did, so I'll just tell you briefly. So it's kind of interesting how it ended up there. Carp in Chinese culture is a very special fish. It was believed to actually transform into a dragon. A dragon was associated with the emperor, and the dragon also, in mythological terms, was considered to bring the rains, which was responsible for successful harvests and agriculture throughout China. The carp also became a symbol of perseverance and overcoming adversity, because when it came time to spawn, towards the end of its life, it would swim upstream and leap up little waterways and such to reach the area where it was born. And then finally, it also became the emblem of a student passing his civil service exams, and the success of doing that would ensure him a wonderful career in the imperial court, in some sort of clerkship, and a great career. The spout and the handle on this teapot, there's a lot in this one little piece, is formed from a lotus. A lotus, of course, was also a very Asian and sort of Buddhist emblem. It was an emblem of reincarnation and sort of longevity. So we know all this today because we know we've had more contact, we have more scholarly insight. A European at the time realistically just saw it as a beautiful piece, and an object such as this would have been a prime candidate for a Kunstkammer, one of these wonderful collector cabinet rooms of the aristocracy at the time where they collected odd and unusual beautiful objects from all over the world. The carp is a rare type from that time. It's rare today. There aren't too many of them that are found like this from the Ming dynasty. You'll sometimes see crayfish ewers from the same period, and occasionally I've seen phoenixes as well. There's one in the Taft Museum in Cincinnati, but they're all quite rare and wonderful. So let's begin to fast forward a little bit into the 17th century, the second part of the 1600s, the end of the Ming dynasty into the Qing. So we spent some time talking about crackware and the individual types of pieces like the carp ewer, but we have to remember we look at a lot of these pieces today as collectors and connoisseurs, and we're interested in the art and the forms. At the time they were made, they were recognized for being beautiful and wonderful, but there was definitely a commerce side about it. And one thing I could say in common about all crackware is it had a practical purpose. It sort of all looked the same in forms. It was bowls, cups, and plates of varying shapes and sizes. So we know porcelain was well received in Europe. Everybody was getting excited about it. It was the new fascinating material in town or in Europe. So aside from just getting at that point of what the Chinese were supplying, you begin to see a back and forth between European merchants, and they're beginning to have some input into the designs that they wanted to see made into porcelain. And what was wonderful about porcelain, particularly in Europe where it did not exist, was that you could take almost any existing form, be it wood, metal, or whatever, and have it copied into porcelain. And it didn't have to necessarily be practical or have a use, and I think very soon these things became just rare oddities and collectibles in many cases. And let's just look at a few examples here. So the pair on the left date to about, I'd say 1670, 1680. It's believed they were probably made for the Dutch market. The decoration on them with the landscapes and floral designs are very classically Chinese, but the shape is absolutely not a Chinese shape. And it appears that they were based either on glass or some wood form. Strangely enough, or I suppose it could be metal that was sent to China. Either they had a model or they had a picture of such. Some merchant there ordered a whole bunch of them, and they brought them back to be used as drinking beakers. The pair on the right are purely decorative. I show them because they're a very famous type of export ware from the early Kangxi period. They're known as Venetian glass export form vases, and that's because the form was based on Venetian glass. How that made it to China in one piece, I have no idea. And it's sort of, you don't see very much, I would say, like Italian-themed or Italian glass-themed porcelains, but somehow or other, there was this wonderful connection. Here is a very wonderful example. The form, again, is very much based on existing glass forms from Venice. The decoration, however, is more Oriental or Asian, and certainly not Italian. We'll look at a few more examples here. The pair of vases on the left is another example going into some polychrome. The form overall is pretty much Chinese, but that spiral design is probably based on silver or metalware from Europe, or perhaps glass. The way the flowers are drawn is not really, I would say, classically Chinese. It looks to me a little Indian, or perhaps continental European textile. So it's an interesting blend of styles. The piece in the center, the blue and white covered urn, basically, is fascinating in three ways. It was made in China, sort of 1690, 1700. It's believed to have been based on a Dutch silver form, but the decoration on this is actually not really very Chinese. And I think if you're familiar with it, it looks quite sort of Islamic in a way. And that's not a surprise for reasons we'll discuss later when we talk about different colors. The third piece on the right, I think to me, visually and aesthetically gets it right. The form is a chocolate pot. Drinking chocolate, thank you, Europe, became popular in the late 1600s, and there was a silver form that became the quintessential chocolate pot. and one must have been sent to China and was copied as an export form. But quite remarkably, the decoration on this one is 100% Chinese, and it's sort of this very weird primordial view of like the birth of a dragon or the birth of the sacred pearls, which were connected to dragons. It has absolutely no relation to Western culture at all, but I must say artistically it lays out in a cleaner way than some of the others that we're looking at. And it's just an example to me where I tune in is this wonderful interplay between East and West, and each market sort of trying to feel each other out. It was sort of a luxury market, of course, but a practical one, and it's just interesting to see some of these early forms. Another type we should talk about is the classic garniture set. This came into popularity in the late 1600s, particularly in the Kangxi period. Garnitures were based on an altar set in China. In China, the centerpiece would have been an incense burner, surrounded, the two on either side would be pricket candle holders, and the covered vessels would be storage jars to a degree. This combination of numbers, usually they're fives, they're usually odd numbers, 5, 7s, occasionally 9, depending how much space you were trying to cover. In Europe became alternating shapes of covered vessels and these sort of open beaker pieces in between. The pieces here have a very Chinese look to them, but the layout is kind of European, and again, it's this wonderful mixture of cultures and interests at that time. Garnitures became a quintessential type of decorative art in Holland, certainly, and elsewhere in Europe, and they're very popular to put on large cabinets or mantelpieces, where you'll see them in manor homes today in historical settings. So using porcelain in European interiors had a practical and decorative purpose, but very quickly it also spread beyond just being a special dining set, or maybe a decorative flourish on a mantelpiece or a piece of furniture. And let's have a look at this. At the highest levels of society, pretty much at the aristocratic level and above, starting in the 17th century and onward, architectural design began to incorporate Chinese porcelain on an extraordinary grand scale. And decorating with Chinese porcelain became an art in itself, if not quite an obsession, and this spread all over Europe. This remarkable interior here is from the Santos Palace in Lisbon. Today it's the French embassy, but at the time it was built, it was an aristocratic home. And one of its famous features that I am showing you here is this interior sort of pyramid-shaped cathedral roof, for lack of a better term, that was covered every square inch in blue and white porcelain from the 16th and 17th centuries. Pretty much. It makes me nervous to look at this. I assume they were all very firmly secured, but it's absolutely unbelievable and just astonishing to see. Another example with a little more space is this room from Charlottenburg Palace outside of Berlin. This was a classic China room or porcelain gallery, and you see at this point porcelain that a lot of us, or I certainly think of the individual importance of a piece almost becomes obscured by this amazing totality, just overwhelming presence. And it's beautiful, a little overwhelming, it's garish, it's sort of hard to take in. It's a type of picture I feel I have to keep with me being in the field. When anybody tells me that they're running out of room in their home and they have no more room for porcelain, I am going to break out these pictures of the Santos Palace and Charlottenburg, and you'll see, indeed, there are many ways you can use them for sure. A final picture of this type here is a little more easy to digest. I took this at the Rijksmuseum not too long ago. It's filled with beautiful, really stunning Kangxi blue and white porcelains, mostly from the late 17th century. And it gives you just a taste without maybe being overwhelmed to the degree of the other rooms that we saw, of just how seriously people took porcelain as a decorative jewel, in a sense, and entered it into wonderful creative architectural pieces. So as I said, a lot of palaces in Europe had their porcelain or in China rooms, and collecting became a mass obsession for some. And I would have to mention, I think, without a doubt, the most famous collector of Chinese porcelain from antiquity, who happened to be a man named Augustus the Strong. He was the elector of Saxony, the ruler of Saxony, and also became the king of Poland. He lived from 1670 to 1723, so pretty much the Kangxi period, for those who are in the know, so my kind of man. And he was the most famous and voracious collector of Chinese and Japanese porcelain in that period. He self-diagnosed himself with a terrible disease, and the only one I wish on anyone, which he called la maladie de porcelain. It was the porcelain illness, and he admitted to it. He was absolutely obsessed, and he had a collection of tens of thousands of pieces, both Japanese and Chinese porcelain, that he has in his palaces, and then it just had no end. He was also famous, you might have heard of the term soldier vase. He was famous for trading a troop of guards with another potentate nearby who had a wonderful collection of large porcelain vases about 3 or 4 feet high. So that term, if you ever hear it, was connected to him. Remnants of his collection can still be seen today in the Zwinger Museum in Dresden. Before he died, he was planning to build a Japanese palace totally devoted to porcelain. That didn't quite happen. And over the years, some of that huge collection has been dispersed. But you can still see wonderful examples if you happen to ever be in Dresden. What's also important to know about Augustus the Strong was that he was not only a wonderful patron of Chinese and Japanese porcelain, but he was instrumental in the beginnings of the production of European porcelain. And he was sort of obsessed with discovering the secret, the key to making porcelain in Europe. And among the very first types is Meissen porcelain, which he very much was behind, and that first came into the picture in 1710. So let's keep that in mind as we continue our discussion. So in a lot of the photographs I've shown you, blue and white porcelain seems to dominate, and it's a good starting off point to just talk about some of the decorative types that you'll find in porcelain from the 17th and 18th century. So blue and white has never gone out of style. It was the first type of porcelain, aside from certain types of monochrome, created in the 13th century, and made up till today. It is extremely popular, came in every possible shape and style. But we readily associate it with China, but a sort of a well-kept secret, unless you know, is that its origin was truthfully very much connected to the Middle East. And the best cobalt that was used in making this blue glaze was actually that which was imported from the Middle East. It was part of the China trade at that period. A lot of early shapes in blue and white, not these in particular, were based on Islamic or Middle Eastern forms, and that were adapted by the Chinese court, and some of it became imperial ware. And certain styles of decoration, which I'll say in the piece I showed you before, and this one even to a degree, these sort of arabesque reserves and such, have sort of a Middle Eastern flair, and it never quite goes away. So you'll find it in very interesting places as you follow blue and white porcelain. Stepping away from colored designs, let's take a little step to the right to Fujian Province, Delaware, the home of Blanc de Chine. I mentioned it very briefly before. Jingdezhen porcelain was the main type. The blue and whites, the polychromes and such were from Jingdezhen. Delaware was the neighboring province where Blanc de Chine was made. Blanc de Chine, as we know it, was in the trade from the very beginning as well. So from the Ming, or even Yuan, I suppose you'll find examples, but mostly Ming and later. It's a very simple type of decoration in a sense that it accentuates the whiteness of the porcelain, but you then get this wonderful focus on the forms, and you get a lot of wonderful cups, and the one on the right is sort of based on a rhino horn carving. You can get some really fascinating little pieces, and these types of pieces also would be put on the walls of these magnificent palaces in different shapes and sizes, and it added to the grandeur. Because it was white, it also very happily lent itself to ormolu mounts, so you can find beautiful Blanc de Chine with these gilded mounts, and I'm sure silver as well. Aside from small objects, you'll also see the introduction of figures into decorative arts in the West. This is a very traditional Chinese figure of Guandi, the Taoist god of war. It's very faithfully done and very well executed. I have absolutely no idea how it ended up going to Europe in an early date, but it did. It dates to the end of the Ming Dynasty or early Qing, sort of 17th century, perhaps the association with the general on his horse that struck a chord with the military side or just the zeitgeist of the time in China, and these types of figures were very popular as well. And then you get a wonderful example of these. If you look closely, the figures that are riding on these mythical animals, these are food lions. They're not real. They're sort of the quintessential, like the dragon. The food lion was this sort of playful guardian figure at this point. But the figures riding on top of them are not Chinese. They happen to be Europeans. So it's this wonderful fascination. You can feel the East meeting the West meeting the East, and just this amusement, shock, awe, beauty, falling in love with the culture that can be encapsulated in wonderful small objects like this. And these types of maybe souvenir type pieces or somehow reminiscences of China trade became very popular in Europe. The most popular type of Blanc de Chine figure is the Bodhisattva Guanyin, the so-called goddess of mercy, protector of women and children, and hearer of prayers. She was not really a god, a goddess. She was a bodhisattva, one destined to be a Buddha. But in the West, we merge all sorts of terms together. This one is an example that's in Dresden from the Augustus the Strong collection. So it's a very classic Chinese-looking piece. It's not the most fancy. It was probably mold designed and such. But somehow it made its way to Europe in an early period. It's sort of early Qing, maybe very late Ming. A variant form that became more popular in the 18th century, or sort of the end of the Kangxi reign, that we'll talk about later, was this type of Blanc de Chine lady, also holding a child. In my mind, it's a bit of a secularized version of Guanyin, but you could equally argue, I'm sure, that it was just a court lady who happened to be holding a child, and it was just a popular sort of Oriental Chinese-looking motif that people loved. I do think, however, the connection between the Guanyin figure and this type of figure to Europe, and them showing up in great quantities, was that the Guanyin was easily identifiable with another famous coupling of a mother and child in Europe, and that would be the Madonna and Child. And in case you think I'm making this up, here is an example of a Chinese version, without a doubt, of a Madonna and Child from the Kangxi period, early, probably late 17th century. The features are definitely Chinese, but the stance, the crown on her head, the curly hair of the boy that she's holding, the tresses of her hair, which may be hard to appreciate here, not in person, are definitely not Chinese. And it seems clear that this is based on an image of sort of a devotional figure that was brought to China, or a picture was shown, a wood sculpture, very classic European, French, or German, and even Philippines. There was a lot of Christian presence there, was an influence on this. And then seeing the three together, you can see sort of a progression. The middle figure and the Madonna and Child, so-called on the right, I think are, if you just change the heads, it's actually pretty close. So it's just rather an interesting thing to see. But Guanyin was the most popular figure in China, and the most popular Blanc de Chine figure to come to the West. So returning to Zhengzheng porcelain, the main source of porcelain, in the mid-1600s, aside from blue and white Kraak ware and the occasional interesting carp ewer or crayfish ewer, you would get polychrome decorated pieces. This is the classic type of that period. It's known as Wucai, 5-colored decorated porcelain. The 5 colors are underglazed blue, green, rouge de fur, or this iron red, yellow, and aubergine. This one does not have much aubergine. There's sometimes touches of black and other colors that don't seem to get counted in the 5. But this was the classic polychrome decoration that came to Europe, and usually as vases. I don't think I've ever really seen them as garnitures, so they just seem to be large, imposing shapes that lent themselves well for furniture. Or sometimes you'll see them in fireplaces, I guess, during summer when they weren't being used, but they became very sort of monumental, elegant pieces. They're mostly decorated with Chinese court scenes and figures of ladies and children, or imperial scenes taken from Chinese tales that were unknown to the Europeans at the time, but just gave this wonderful air of the Far East in Europe. The Ming Dynasty came to an end sometime in the middle of the 17th century, and that was a period of turmoil and interruption of a lot of trade between East and West. Japan filled the gap at some points, but there was a lot of independent trade that then continued with China. After the Ming Dynasty, the next dynasty was Qing. And the Qing rulers were Manchus. They were not ethnically Chinese, the Han people. They were Jurchen, and they came from Mongolia. And they were very aware, particularly in the early days, that they were somewhat a foreign entity that had taken control of this unbelievably amazing culture. So one of the first emperors, the second one actually, who got things going and what we could call an establishment was the Emperor Kangxi. He ruled from 1662 through 1722, and he sort of, I think, wanted to be accepted. He wanted Qing rule to be accepted by holdouts who were still loyal to the Ming potentates of the past. And one way that he worked to do this was to be a patron of the arts and traditional Chinese culture. There was all sorts of studies and appreciations of Chinese classics that began, and there were all sorts of innovations and a great imperial patronage of the arts, including material arts like porcelain, that he got involved with. So in the period for the Chinese types of porcelains, it was a time to recreate some of the classics of the Ming that were respected, even though it was a different dynasty. And then they started playing with some of the decorative arts that were existent at the time. So the pair of vases on the left are what we called Wucai. That was the classical late Ming transitional type of porcelain. And then we get what came to be known in the West as Famille Verte. And it was a difference in decorative style, but you can see the connection between them. It may seem strange, but the main difference between them was instead of using underglazed blue that you find on the left with the Wucai, they started using blue as an overglazed decoration. You know, you wouldn't think that's the biggest to do, but it was. It was, it was novel at the time, a radical change. And if you look at the layout, I think the decoration is certainly tighter in the Kangxi ones, the Famille Verte. It becomes a more sort of elegant look in a sense, nothing against the Wucai, but it's a more integrated picture. It's a beautiful painting. You get more gradations of colors and such, where the earlier Ming style was a bit more what I would call staccato, to use a musical term. The colors stick out, but they don't really have much variation in tones. So Famille Verte became the dominant polychrome decoration in the Kangxi period till pretty much the end of the reign. It was popular both in China and, of course, immediately in the West. So let's look at a few examples that made it to the West. And again, like some of the pieces we saw before, some look very Chinese, and some look like an interesting conglomerate of East meets West. So the pair of plates on the left are very classically Chinese with the subject, the rampant mythical animal in the center, the tiger, but the layout and these wonderful scroll reserves around the edges are very classically Chinese. The small pair on the right, these covered jars, I've been told have a Tibetan influence, sort of the pointy finial on the top and the tiered sections on the sides, which are quite beautiful. Tibetan or not influence, I don't know, but a lot of them actually ended up in Europe, and there happened to be a lot that were cataloged in the Augustus Strong collection from the earliest days. So somehow they made it to the West as well, and anything that was exotic, interesting, and beautiful, send it over. They found a market for it for sure, and they are. Going to the next, the one on the left is a hanging cistern. It has a flat back. It would have hung on a wall. It's a form that I think was based primarily on a Portuguese or a Spanish type that then got popularized elsewhere in Europe. It often would have had a companion piece under a basin to catch the water. A spigot would be put in the mouth of the lion. Here it's a Fu lion, of course, because it was from China, in Europe, and then it was used for hand washing. The decoration on this is almost totally Chinese except for the top, which has sort of these dolphin fish partially obscured by the cover, but you can see the tails. Oops, I'll use my handy pointer. That was not Chinese, but the rest was a very Chinese-looking form on an otherwise totally European piece. The object on the right, it goes in the other direction. The form, dishes with flanged rims were considered a foreign form, not traditionally Chinese, so often considered made for the West. But the decoration in the center was a scene from silk culture, and I won't go into too many details, but the exact scene was taken from a series of woodblock prints that were commissioned by the Kangxi emperor, as I said before, to show appreciation to Chinese culture, and silk and porcelain and tea and rice culture were the big things. So he did these, it sounds terrible to say, but it's like a propaganda campaign to sort of endear himself to the people and show this great appreciation to the hard work that went into making these things. And strangely enough, this one scene, like we saw the porcelain production, ended up on a Kangxi plate that went to Europe as an export piece. Towards the end of the Kangxi period in the 1720s, we can begin to see the emergence of a new color type, and that became known as Famille Rose. The introduction of these colors were actually influenced by Jesuit missionaries who were present at the court. Jesuits were in China from the late Ming, the late 1500s, and ever after, pretty much a constant presence, certainly to the mid-18th century. Their goal in going to China was to convert Chinese to Christianity. It, I think, had mixed results. There was some, it worked in some cases, and others it didn't. But one way that they kept their favor at the court, and somehow they had a presence there, was that a lot of these Jesuits seemed to be trained in traditional art and artistry. So when not, I guess, preaching religion, they would show Chinese artists at the court Western perspective and certain other types of enamel work and watches and things that did not really exist readily in China. And it caused a sensation. And strangely enough, though we sometimes think of China as a very introverted society, they were very open to foreign influences. And in the color of the porcelains, apparently, the introduction of these sort of pinky colors, the lighter yellows, pastel shades, were all based on the fine embroidered vestments of Jesuits who were there. And it changed the market, it changed fashions. It's quite an interesting thing. So some of the early pieces, the plate on the right would be an early Famille Rose piece. They're sometimes known as Rose Verte because though it has the new colors, there's a certain layout and look that is very similar to the Famille Verte, which is the plate on the left. But very soon, it went straight to the heavy, more reddish tones and pinks that we know as Famille Rose. The pair on the left is a wonderful pair of openwork vases. They date to about the 1730s or 40s. And the creamer on the right is an extraordinarily jewel of a piece from the Qing period, part of a whole small tea set with the most fantastic gilding and just amazing design quality from that period. But it shows you the change. Aside from polychromes, I'll go a little quicker now, just to show you what was also out there. Monochromes were also popular and exported to the West. The vase on the left is known as mirror black. Dresden, surprise, surprise, has a huge amount of them still on display. I saw them at the Zwinger, and it's really quite elegant. Most black glazed, these are called mirror black because they had a reflective tone to them, were further decorated with gilding on top, so you can get scenes or flowers and such. The gilding tends to wear off over time, so you lose it with rare exception, but they're really quite stunning. The teapot on the right, turquoise, was a very popular color, particularly in France. I'm not a total expert on it, but I think in France, turquoise became an imperial color like Celeste blue with Sèvres and things. So I think that's why it ended up there in particular. And then you'll get greens like the bowl on the bottom, and sometimes aubergines and other colors. Now, aside from forms, vases, plates, dishes, and bowls, and cups, another very popular part of the China trade was figures and animals. So on the left, these are all from the Kangxi period, so about 1700 or so to the early 1700s. The piggyback boys on the left, just exquisite, beautiful painting. These were always popular. The figure on the right is a playing fu lion. Fu lions are probably the most popular animal form that ever made it from east to west. In China, they were intended as guardian figures outside of official buildings and palaces. At some point in the Kangxi reign, the late 1600s and thereafter, they became sort of playful Pekingese, and they became sort of an emblem of just sort of frolicking, fun, exotic animals that you would get in China. Here's another example on the left of two wine ewers that are Kangxi period, the ones on the left. I've seen similar ones in Blenheim Palace in England, so these were intended for trade from the very beginning. The monkey ewer on the right looks sort of Europeanish, but everything about it is sort of Chinese. He's holding a peach in his hands. The handle is formed by sort of a pine tree or peach and pine, and the monkey was associated with peaches, and in China that had to do with finding long life. These types of ewers are extremely rare, and this one is not from Dresden, but they have examples of it, so it's helpful in dating them as well. Then you'll get the mythical animals, the phoenix on the left, sort of the classic, aside from the dragon, the phoenix was an emblem of the empress. And this is a Kangxi example. There are again some in Dresden. I keep bringing up Dresden, not because I'm fixated with it, but it's extremely important because the collection was cataloged several times, particularly in the early 1700s. So if you're trying to understand where pieces went from east to west or what market they're being sent to, it's an invaluable resource. These early inventories are extremely important. So if I can say this piece, there's one like it in Dresden or whatever, it kind of gives you an insight to who the audience was it was being made for, where these things ended up, and to know that there was very high-end China trade. Sometimes it's considered things that were exported and sent to Europe were not fine quality, but that's not true at all. Some of export can be as fine as imperial, where it's different in a sense, but it went directly to the top, and there were all sorts of grades and qualities. So this is an example as well. The dogs on the right were actually a European type of animal that were not in China, but they were taken to China and made into porcelain figures and then exported back to Europe as wonderful porcelain animals. And then just going to show you a magnificent, really remarkable pair of figures is this pair of ladies from sort of the third quarter of the 18th century. Their wonderful quality and just beautifully glazed, a true pair, and everything about them is wonderful. And a fascinating aspect about them is their heads are removable, and they have weights on the bottom. They were used as nodding head figures. You may have seen these types of things sometimes in Dresden, in Meissen porcelain and other European types. I don't know whose came first. It's probable the Chinese were copying the European, but they were all competing for their markets, and it just added this kind of unusual aspect of realism or sort of just kind of fascination to the trade. Now, switching gears slightly, I mentioned a long time ago in this address that Augustus the Strong was important in helping the development of European porcelain. And that began in the 1710s, first in Meissen, and then spread throughout Europe, France, and other parts of continental Europe and England. Though its spread was gradual, and I'm sure I'm not an expert in early European porcelain, the expertise took some time in coming. It seems logical that from the beginning it had an impact on China trade and the diminishing of the need to go to China to get porcelains, even though there was still strong trade in the early parts of the 18th century. But the market was being challenged. And now in Europe you could get locally source your porcelain. You could get things made more directly to what you wanted. It wasn't, you loved maybe Chinese motifs, but you could just have a little bit more control. And it was more readily available. You didn't have to wait a year in each direction, so it was a less perilous journey. So starting mostly, though there are antecedents, you get in the 18th century, I think, responding to this economic pressure, the rise of armorial porcelain. And this became a huge category of Chinese porcelain trade in the 18th century. Armorial porcelain is basically dinner services or tea services that have an element of them of a crest of a noble family from Europe, or sometimes a full coat of arms. So the pair of plates on the left here were made for the Piers family around, putting my glass, 1731. It's considered one of the finest blue and white export armorial sets ever made. The precision and careful painting is extraordinary. One reason I think that people liked going to China was everything had to be hand-painted. There was no transferring, there was no stamping of designs. Everything you're seeing was actually hand-painted with great precision, and they all look pretty much the same, which is great quality control. What's interesting in that wonderful pair of soup plates is that the crest of the Piers family is only this little bit there. Dear. Oh, good, and that is that little piece there. That's the Piers family. The rest is a Chinese design. Fast forward a few years, you have here the Knife family, an armorial service made for a prominent Belgian family. And look what happened. The coat of arms became the central decoration in the middle. And the Chinese, hopefully I won't kill this, is really just in the cavetto and sort of this decoration on the rim and the gilding and such. It's sort of like flip the script. And that is kind of what began to happen. We'll look at two other examples. This is the one on the left is Christian Auguste. The service dates from 1750, and on the right is a piece from a later service of Catherine the Great. They were father and daughter, interestingly enough. Christian Auguste was the Prince of Anhalt and Zerbst, and his daughter became Catherine the Great. What I find fascinating about these pieces, because they date mid-18th century and later, is that there's really nothing Chinese about them. So if you look at the Christian Auguste, it's his coat of arms, which was amazingly painted beautifully. There's no Chinese motif there at all. The rims are done in gilding, but there's no real Chinese anything about it except for the porcelain. and the Catherine the Great on the right, you can pretty much say the same thing. The trellis design, it's Chinese looking a little bit, but it's not really a Chinese motif. And that open work was, you could find in China, but it became just a popular export motif. So we've gone from really embracing China and, incorporating bits of coats of arms and such into decoration to totally, it just happened to be made in China. So presumably there was a quality issue, or just maybe there was a greater cachet to have finer things made in China still at that time. Another thing, or part of the China trade that developed in the 18th century, again, I think quite likely to compete with European porcelain, was the rise of European decorations on Chinese porcelain from the 18th century, and this continued onward. So there are two examples here. The first on the left, though it has a very Chinese feel, was actually designed by a Dutch artist named Cornelius Pronk. He lived in sort of the 1720s and 30s and designed some famous sets of porcelain and sent them with the Dutch East India Company, commissioned them to have made into dinner services and large serving pieces. There's a handful of different designs by him. This one is called Dame au Parasol. It's the woman with the parasol. You can find it in blue and white, sometimes Famille Rose colors, and most often probably this orange and gilt design. So it's interesting. A chinoiserie sent to China by a European, but sent back to Europe and appreciated as a Chinese work of art. It gets a little convoluted and confusing. The piece on the right is interesting. This was based on a woman artist, Sibylla Merian, who was the most famous botanical artist of her time in the early to sort of mid-1700s. And for some reason that nobody has quite explained, one of her flower paintings, and this one being one of them, it also has sort of silkworms and butterflies, was sent to China and copied onto some sort of dinner service. You find it in blue and white, and you'll find it rarely in Famille Rose. The quality is unbelievably great, and the decoration on the border is not really Chinese either. It's sort of, I think, more European. I don't know if it's de Paquier or that sort, but it's just a fascinating thing that ended up in China. Another very popular thing to do in China was to send popular pictures and prints and have them copied onto services. They would be for tea services or dinner services. The variety of subjects were huge. They could range from mythological scenes, biblical scenes, botanical scenes, as we saw, and popular artists like this, Le Pêcheur, a famous type of a European young man fishing, and it just seemed like a marketable, beautiful piece. You can find political subjects. You can find erotica subjects. I did not include any, I'm sorry to say, tonight, but you can find a lot of unusual things. But what's also very unusual is the cup and saucer on the right. I just have to point out weird things that can end up on Chinese porcelain subjects. This shows the assassination of poor George Brander from 1785. George Brander was an official with the British East India Company. He had a very successful career and then retired to England. He had a nephew who was reprobate. He was a gambler, everything wrong he did. And at some point, apparently, he ran up terrible gambling debts and just got into a lot of trouble. He wanted his uncle to bail him out. His uncle did not bail him out, and they had a fight, and nephew stabbed and ultimately killed George, the uncle. This became a huge cause célèbre at the time, and for reasons I cannot imagine, became the subject for a Chinese export tea set. It's like having the O.J. Simpson, whatever, trial of the time being made and commemorated. It happens to be extremely beautifully painted, but just some of the bizarre things you can sometimes find. So basically, these types of decorated porcelains, armorials, and Western designs dominated till pretty much the end of the 18th century. And by that point, there was a true diminishing of the need for Chinese porcelain. And you see the tapering off, with rare exception, of the classic designed items from China coming to the West. What did arise at this time, because nobody gives up, was the rise of, if you look at the blue and white on the left, popularized dinner services. This is the period which you begin to get the famous Canton, willow, and Nanking patterns. These were popular patterns on blue and white porcelain. You'll see it throughout New England. You'll find it in England as well. These weren't meant as individual works of art in a sense. They were meant as, elegant dining services. They're not quite the same as the earlier pieces, but some of them can be really quite strikingly beautiful. Some are kind of cruder, so you got to pick and choose a bit as a collector, but they're wonderful forms from this period of time. The Turinen cover on the right is known as Fitzhugh. It's orange Fitzhugh, a beautiful decorative type with this medallion design in the center, and then surrounded by all these beautiful flower designs and trellises. This is strikingly beautiful in the orange and gold. You can find it in green occasionally, and blue and white. It was a very popular, good quality product that was found in Europe and also the United States in these early periods of China trade. Another very popular service from the early 1800s is maybe familiar to many people here. It's known as the Rockefeller Pattern Service. It's anachronistically named for John D. Rockefeller Jr., but it's actually because he had a service of porcelains that looked like this, a full one. It has these figural decorations in the center that can be quite beautifully decorated, and then they're very lovingly, ornately designed around the sides in these reserves of buildings and sort of landscapes and what have you, set against this really striking gold ground. So some people collect Rockefeller pattern. It's a very beautiful example as well. And then being in the United States and in New England, I have to talk about our presence with China trade. So the reality is our country came into existence post-prime, post the great moments of great artistry for the most part. But the new nation was actively engaged with trade for China for all sorts of things. And though you might not get the most elaborate artistic individual objects, you'll get a lot of porcelains from that period that were associated with interesting political people at the time, or the first traders with China. It's a different way of collecting and a different way of focus, but it's a fascinating history of its own. And then you'll sometimes get pieces that have patriotic themes. You'll see a lot with sailing ships and American flags. We were the proud new country. And it's a legitimate, wonderful period to study in itself, and it has a loyal following. You'll get some political items also from this period, and I'm illustrating one. This is a commemorative noting the death of George Washington in the very early 1800s. This is part of a famous service that was made for Joseph and Rebecca Sims. Dates about 1800 to 1802 and shows Washington's tomb. And he was, of course, the father of our country and had a huge following at the time. And is a very elegant, simple form. It was part of a whole dinner set, but a very famous one at that. And then just fast forwarding finally to the middle section of the 19th century, most of the China trade, the historic part of the grand trade with East and West, was somewhat coming to an end. The types of decorative porcelains that emerged were sort of, again, decorative dinner services. It's a period you'll find descriptive names like the cabbage pattern or butterfly patterns. And then perhaps most famously here is this large bowl here that's known as rose medallion. It's somewhat similar to the Rockefeller pattern, I guess, with the figural designs in the center, but it features these little pink flowers here and there. And it's become a very collectible type of thing as well. And that's pretty much what brought the Chinese export porcelain, carried it through to the end of the 19th century. And with this, I would call it the end of the historic period of collecting Chinese porcelain in the West. But I'll just give you a 2-minute sequel, because I have to tell you that with the demise of the Chinese Empire in the last part of the 19th century, the 1850s, and later, the same time as rose medallion and such, and cabbage pattern, the Chinese Empire, of course, was becoming undone. Foreign colonial powers were in China and getting access to things to the West that had never come to the West before. So this was the period where traditional Chinese porcelains, things made for the Chinese taste, for the Chinese courts, first were exposed to European and Western collectors and were very happily collected at that time. At the same point, there was a revival of great interest in Kangxi period blue and white porcelains, and Yangzheng and early Qianlong porcelains, and that started the era of modern collectors in England and the United States. And that brings us almost to the modern period. Some famous names from that period were in England, George Salting, George Emephopoulos, William Bennett, Leonard Gow. In France, Ernest Grandidier had a huge collection of Chinese porcelain. In this country, James Garland, William Walters, J.P. Morgan, Henry Clay Frick, Peter Widener, and John D. Rockefeller Jr., of course. And all these people collected everything in certain ways. They collected the Chinese tastes, they collected the great export wares as well. And so, with that, I would say gives you, in a nutshell, 500 years of collecting Chinese porcelain in the West. It's a tremendous, tremendous field. It's exhausting. You may be exhausted. I'm exhausted. But there's so much more to be said. And if you're ever at a show where we're exhibiting, I'd be happy, or coming to New York, I welcome the opportunity to discuss porcelains with you in person. And as time permits, I'd be happy to take a few questions. And I thank you for attending tonight. All right, I don't know the protocol, but if anybody has a question, I'm happy to hear it. If not, we can chat independently. All right, I've said it all. Yes, you. Sure. Yeah. You see it occasionally as a monochrome, but it was usually an accessory color, I would say. I don't know why that's the case. Blue and white was the most popular, Famille Verte and Wucai probably second. But as a monochrome, you don't see it quite as much. I don't know the exact reason. Certain colors in China, if it's Chinese taste porcelain, were associated with imperial things. So yellow was a reserved color, and certain colors had an inner coating for whom they were made. So it may have to deal with the rank of who had more things being made for him or her at that period. Sure. Yes? Well, that's a good question. I would tell you that a lot of people, at least in my field, come from China to the West to collect authentic antique porcelains. So there's a plus and a negative to that. The plus side is they're coming to get pieces they know have been out of China. It's like a time capsule effect that were made in antiquity, or the more Chinese tastes came out in the 19th century. On the positive side, if you can say, they're doing that because there's a situation of a lot of fakes being made in China. There's no way around it, and some really great quality. Some, I'm sure, are very hard to tell the difference between the authentic and the inauthentic. Some it's not as difficult. So there's active porcelain production done in China, and Jingdezhen to this very day. It's a huge production. And sometimes there's modern artists who came into the picture in the 20th century, in the Republic period and such. But there's really fine porcelain making today. I wish it weren't manufactured to deceive, but you can have really great artistry for sure, even today. Yes?
Mention Benjamin Altman.
Yes, I should mention Benjamin Altman too, thank you. So Benjamin Altman, like J.P. Morgan, he was a huge patron at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he had a huge collection in the early 1900s of Kangxi, the classic things that were the most collected. So very similar in types to George Salting, J.P. Morgan, and such. The Morgan collection, which is for another discussion, was that sort of overwhelmed every collection in the United States in its time, just in number and quality. And it was on loan at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the early 1900s. So were the pieces from Benjamin Altman. I think they both served on the board at the museum. I think it was hoped and assumed that the Morgan collection would be gifted to the museum upon J.P. Morgan's demise, but his son did not do that, and either they needed the money or whatever it was a huge amount of money. It did not end up there. So that was a huge loss for the museum, although a lot of those pieces entered the Rockefeller collection and other famous collections at the time, I can tell you privately. However, Benjamin Altman, who had similar tastes, maybe not in the same quantity, did leave all his things to the Met, and the core of the wonderful decorative porcelains, Kangxi, the things that were collected at that period, the Famille Rose, the early decorative grand porcelains of late Ming to early Qing, are well represented at the Met, and it is because of Benjamin Altman. So I thank you for bringing him up. Yes, I should definitely mention him, for sure. Yes?
Do you buy in China or not?
You cannot legally buy antiquities in China, so no. My grandfather, I have letters where there were agents in China in the early 1900s who could legally get items. But back then, authenticity was a huge thing as well. Most of the porcelains I showed you until the end, excuse me, actually you would not find in China. They were made for the intent of selling to the West from the very beginning, so they're truthfully already over here. The Chinese taste items that first came on the market, you could get there, and there are some wonderful collections. Former President Herbert Hoover, for example, had a magnificent collection of blue and white porcelain, and his collection started because he and his wife, before he was president, were stationed in China, and for people of a certain wealth, honestly, or whatever, who was bringing there, they were offered a lot of things that were coming out of the palaces or aristocratic collections under duress or whatever, and those things began to make it to the West. Early excavated items like Han and Tang and archaic pieces were really first discovered starting in quantity in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So a lot of that also came to the West, but there was also a lot of fakes that were made too. But we do not personally buy from China today, no. You can legally, I think, buy from Hong Kong, but you got to be cautious, to say the least, for different reasons. All right.
Well, thank you, Stephen. That
You're
was
welcome,
great.
thank you.
Really appreciate it. If anybody else has any additional questions, please come up privately. Thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
you.
Bye.